Good morning. Thanks everyone for getting up early, and welcome to our panel on carbon markets and whether they are in fact the solution to climate change. You know, in Davos this week, we've all found ourselves talking a lot about the economic crisis, and here in this panel we're going to talk about the fact is in the middle of this economic crisis, in the wreckage of our global economy, can carbon markets still be the answer to controlling climate change? It's clear that this perfect economic storm will eventually pass, but climate change will not, unless we figure out a way to transform markets that in a way that goes beyond boundaries, cultures, and nationalities. And that's really what we're here to discuss today, because while only governments can create the mandatory limits or caps that create markets, governments themselves actually cannot solve climate change. That's going to take people and businesses to do. And so what we're here to discuss is how can we all and people around the world make sense of this very complicated issue? How can we make sense of it and come up with a solution that will not only determine our fate, but quite literally the fate of our children and our grandchildren? In other words, I think we're here to discuss this morning, can we save ourselves from ourselves? And so the sorts of questions we want to get into this morning are, how do we enlist the cooperation of all nations to bring down carbon emissions? What sort of financial incentives will attract all countries to get involved and entrepreneurs to get involved? What sorts of technologies offer promise? How do we persuade every element of our global economy to innovate on behalf of a low-carbon economy? I was at a session yesterday where the Prime Minister of Norway said that he believes the answer to these questions lie in a cap-and-trade system. I would reveal my bias. I also agree with that. I think we can create a market that eclipses the market for the dot-coms and the computer revolution, a market to drive low carbon. But I want to introduce my panelists and our panelists here this morning and get on with the discussion. Lars Josefsson is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Vattenfall, one of the largest power generators in the world. Pierre Lagrange is the managing partner of GLG Partners and is among Europe's largest investors in alternative asset managers. Congressman Baird is a representative from the state of Washington. He's just been elected chairman of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee of the House Science and Technology Committee, and very passionate about the issue of climate change. And Nick Francis is the executive chairman of Cool NRG International from Australia and has done projects around the world in energy efficiency, and I hope we'll get into that as well. As a starting point, I'd like to turn to you, Lars, and ask, is this mission of reducing carbon emissions globally to the level we need, is it possible? Can we do that? Your company, Vattenfall, was one of the first to commission a study from McKinsey that looked at that question. What can we learn? What did you learn from this study?
Thank you, Fred. What we did, and that was 3.5 years ago, was, as you say, we, together with McKinsey in a joint venture form, we decided to make a bottom-up study, that is, to make a total inventory of everything mankind knew of actions to abate emissions. So this was a global study. It was also a study of over the time until 2030. It took into account forecasts of technological development, economical development, and price developments. And the result was then what is now known as cost curves, and you can, for the globe or for the world, we have a global cost curve. So what it does show is all individual actions possible to be taken and what they cost in relationship to business as usual, and also its respective potential in abating emissions. You can draw a lot of conclusions from that, but to answer your question, Fred, yes, it is doable. Secondly, it is relatively cheap, and a surprisingly large part of the actions to be taken are profitable. That is, they are cheaper than business as usual. These are very often in the area of energy efficiency, by the way. The second version, the updated 2.0 version of this cost curve, were published this Monday and launched at the press conference in Brussels. This is now higher resolution, better quality, an update. And of course, we hope this will be a fact base that the world can use, because everything is open source, in order to, one, develop company strategies, and two, develop policies, how to actually get hold of this potential. This updated study also shows that it's relatively important that we act very soon, because we do not have much time if we're going to stay below the 2 degrees centigrade with the state of science at the moment.
Okay, I think that's an important predicate, that it's doable, and the work of McKinsey is really groundbreaking, and I think it's a phenomenal contribution of Vattenfall to have launched that study. Lars, let me ask you, as a participant in the European trading system, the first carbon system among many countries and industries in Europe, what was learned from the first system, and how is it working today in 2009?
There's been a lot of lessons learned, and there was a trial period between 2005 and 2008. You learned a lot from that. One is that the system was not harmonized. That is, that the Union let the different member states design how they allocated, how much they allocated, what the rules of the game would be. The result of that, maybe not very odd, is that you had an over-allocation, because everybody would like to protect their own industry. You had a lack of transparency. That is, emissions data were not available to the market. And of course, as the market data then became available, then the over-allocation was suddenly transparent and the market price collapsed, as it should do. So there was nothing wrong with the market, but there were some bugs in how you did it, the transparency and so on. Now we're in the second period, and the European Union has learned a lot. So it's now more harmonized, control of the data, better transparency, and the market really works. So I would say it's not perfect. It will be even better in the next period, after 1st of January 2013. But what I can say as a market participant is that it actually has an input, a decisive input to every decision we make in our company. It has an input to every day's operation in our power plants. So actually, literally every day, we decide how should we run our power plants due to the price on the emission trading system that day. And of course, the investments goes without saying. So the system works. I think the EU has done the world a service to debug the system. It costed us a lot, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned from it. So it really works.
Great. Pierre, let me turn to you. You manage a large investment fund. You take into account carbon footprint. Many of your investments operate, as I understand it, in the European Union. There's now this cap-and-trade system. What difference does the carbon market make? What observations do you have as an investor?
Great, Fred. It was for us really what started us all in investing in environmental solution when the cap-and-trade market was started in Europe, because even though initially we thought it was a bit of a joke, the over-allocation, it got us to work on how come there was such difference between one company and another. And we realized that there was a big difference in carbon pollution, which was now measurable and on which you could put a price per unit of industrial output, whether it's for a yogurt pot or for pasta or for a car. And I think to take what Vice President Gore said yesterday in one of the panels, is that it lagged before a sort of market price signal. And I think what this carbon emission schemes and trading scheme has put is that it's putting a price on liabilities which down the road are going to have to be absorbed by the companies. And we then did a lot of more work, which we were so keen to see validated by the McKinsey study, which was for us one of the most important things we've ever seen, is that it's going to go to all sectors, because there's no reason why only the producing side should actually be paying for the carbon sort of bill, but it should also be the people who are using it. And so for us, that's what's very important. The second thing is that it's very important for fixing a price of the advantage of other industries which are going to be competing against traditional source of energy, so we can really see the value of carbon reduction. Because again, in a big capitalistic world in which I obviously believe, being where I work, it's really pricing that's going to force, and cost that's going to force a lot of adjustment for people.
Let me ask you this, Pierre. If the carbon market is extended to more countries, and if deeper reductions are required, what effect will that have on investment in the low-carbon alternatives?
It's going to increase, because I think you can't go to all industries or to most industries without going globally. If you look at the pulp and paper industry, for instance, for them the compliance to the carbon emission scheme is really, really tough, because if they take a hit because of the carbon on their margin, their competitors all over the planet in a very global market will not. So if you do apply that to pulp and paper, which is a big industry from the carbon standpoint, it's very unfair to them. So you sort of can only have it working if it's becoming a global accepted. And you can see that in the European, the latest direction from the Parliament, they plan to move from 20% to 30% reduction, provided that we get an international agreement. So it's really key.
Thank you. Congressman, I want to turn to you. I've arrived in Davos as you did, and I think finding a lot of the folks here in Europe very excited about the new administration. In your role as the new chairman of the Energy Environment Committee, you're going to have a big role along with the House of Representatives. I understand the House is likely to move first in the American system on comprehensive climate legislation. How urgent and important do you think this problem is? And as we've talked about it to the American people, as we've talked about it globally, are we getting the message across, or are there some insights that you have about how we could do a little better?
I had the privilege a year ago of leading a delegation of the House Science Committee to Antarctica, the Kuranda rainforest, and the once Great Barrier Reef. And so we saw the impacts of the situation on 3 different ecosystems, all of which are vulnerable. And the first place I would start is actually by changing our language. We've paradoxically labeled a catastrophic event with pleasant terms. We speak of climate change, which we just elected a president on the platform of change. Change is generally considered good. We speak of global warming. Warming is a good word. The reality of what we're dealing with is lethal overheating of our planet, deoxygenation of the atmosphere, and acidification of the oceans. And I would suggest that here at Davos and
in our debates, we call it what it is. It's a bit like a doctor saying to you, not that you have cancer, which would get your attention, but you have somewhat accelerated cellular growth in certain parts of your body. Or instead of a thief is coming to break into your home, you're having some unexpected guests this evening. It's hard to expect the world to mobilize if they don't get the problem. Secondly, I think the time frame is completely off. If you understand the literature, as most people in this room do, and the research I think is very solid, I don't think the kind of numbers we're talking about in terms of 2050 reductions are anything close to what we need to do. If that same doctor treating you for unexpected cellular growth said, and by the way, we hope to treat it by 2050, you might suggest, doctor, could we not start tomorrow? Could we perhaps accelerate the solution to pace comparable to the rate of cellular growth? The reason I say this is I think the place to start is behavior change. And my own belief is we should set a worldwide, a certainly industrialized world, and I know we could do this in the United States, of 20% reduction in 20 weeks. I'll say it again, 20% reduction in 20 weeks. Now, my hunch is people are saying, that's preposterous, nobody talks about that. I would just ask you to walk through your daily life and see if you can't find 20% reduction in how much energy used to shower, how much energy used for transportation, the lighting in your office, etc. It is quite achievable in that time frame and would have profound benefits. It would immediately put money back in the pocket. If we had 20% reduction in energy expense, the stimulus would be obviated. The price of energy would go down because the supply-demand curve would get right, and it would have, I think, particularly salutary foreign policy implications as well, and we could do that in 20 weeks. Then we can move, I think, towards some form of cap-and-trade system. The only question I'll put on that I know will be debated in Congress is this climate change, or better yet, the fatal or lethal overheating change skeptics say, well, it's a hidden tax. And if it's a hidden tax, where will the revenue go and how will we pay for it? I think there are good answers, and we should discuss that. But again, I would suggest that we change the wording, call it what it is, and change the time frame and address the urgency that is present.
Well, Congressman, thank you for that. I think those are some very provocative and good suggestions. But you say that, then we may move to a cap-and-trade bill, and there will be concerns about whether it's a tax or not. There are other concerns that will be raised in the halls of Congress, other legitimate concerns based on the early European experience that Lars talked about. Can you mention what the other concerns that will have to be addressed in legislation, not only for it to pass, but to make sure that the market works?
Two predominant ones. One, if it is portrayed as a tax at a time of an economic downturn, people will be led to believe by the opponents of change that we can't afford it, so that it'll be one further crushing blow to an already damaged economy, and it will focus not on the broad issues of where industrial behavior changes, but on what will your electricity bill be at the end of the week and how much is gasoline going to cost. Now, frankly, I believe that both of those, for the sake of the planet, if we're going to fight lethal overheating, ought to be higher, because I think behavior will respond to that. But that's a difficult political sell. The second issue is on the heels of the financial collapse, anything that sounds like a complicated structure potentially subject to gaming is going to be, I think, profoundly suspect. And people are going to suppose, not without substantial justification, that this will be one more opportunity for a bunch of smart guys to manipulate the system at the expense of everybody else, and in this case, of the planet as well.
So the rules will have to make for complete transparency, and have to be a regulated market for sure.
Indeed, and any revenue that's generated, I think, will need to be real clear. We're not going to spend it on additional programs, but I think it needs to go to three things. One, stimulating growth in alternative energy. Two, reducing, in our country's case, the deficit. And three, some form of international social justice for the people who have suffered from lethal overheating and not benefited from it.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll get back to you in a minute. Nick, I want to call on you, and you've had experience on the ground in some of the developing countries. Can you describe for us what that experience has been and how this cap-and-trade system has affected it in the past and may affect it in the future?
Sure. First of all, just to say, I mean, I'm sure everyone's saying it to you, but congratulations. We are in a different place now. We are in a different world. We have a different administration. The reason we weren't going forward and couldn't see the possibilities that we see now are about the administration, and good luck. You've got a great opportunity to lead that. And I'm all up for 20 in 20 weeks. I mean, I do energy efficiency. The thing about if we're going to hit our targets, whatever size targets they are, 50% of this is going to come from energy efficiency, and much of it is more profitable than doing business as usual. Much of that energy efficiency you can deliver tomorrow. It's just buyable. We can go out and get it at the store just down the road here. It's very simple. It's about behaviour change. But actually people don't do it. Our lives are packed with important things, holidays, cars. What are we going to do with the children? Who's going to babysit tonight because we're going out for a drink? And yet within that, energy efficiency is very doable. So I think the question is, energy efficiency is 50% of the solution. Of that 50%, half of that, so 25% of our solution over the next 20 years is what we do in our homes. It's domestic energy efficiency. Now, that's kind of exciting, partly because in terms of anti-poverty, if you do the energy efficiency as well as in industry, but you do it in people's homes and you do it early, you reduce their costs. So the fears about, but my fuel bill is going to go up and I'm going to be using more petrol, the petrol is going to cost more. If you deliver the energy efficiency early, that changes. So some things. We in Great Britain gave away, not actually last weekend, 4 million light globes, but slightly earlier, 5 million, free of charge to mostly elderly people and poor people in the UK. When we decided we were going to do it, I met with many CEOs of power companies in the UK, said, not possible, not possible, not possible. We gave away 5 million in a day, the largest energy efficiency campaign ever in the world. 2 months later, British Gas came out, who had told me it was impossible, and gave away 50 million to all their customers. So we actually can have 20 in 20 weeks. President Obama said it himself. If we all just pumped up our tyres in America, we would reduce the need of our oil by 7%. Well, but the exploration on Antarctica is only going to deliver 5%. So we can cut that out. We just got to pump up our tyres, but we don't. So you've got to have some legislation. You've got to say every single time you stop a car for speeding, you get out and the policeman checks your tyres. And if your tyres aren't the right level, you're going to get fined $200 because then your behaviour will change. So we need a mix of things.
Nick, how does, that's all great and efficiency clearly really big. How does the cap and trade system affect how much of this efficiency work and other technologies get introduced into the system?
Well, if you don't have a cap and trade system and then you don't open it up to be able to be tradable, you don't get new players. So I'm a new player. I don't know how to create energy using coal. Never done it. What I do know is how to deliver energy efficiency. And in Great Britain, for example, we have an emissions trading scheme, and then they've said, okay, there's a bit for energy efficiency, so energy efficiency gets its place, and within that, there's a market that new players can come in and deliver. So I go to power companies and say, how much is it going to cost you to get your energy efficiency? And they say, about £2 per whatever it is, and I go, okay, let me do it for £1.50, and I'll deliver you the Sun newspaper tomorrow, front page with Gordon Brown. So I get to go and play in a market where somebody else hasn't. In a developing country, in Mexico at the moment, we're looking at doing a program. Good morning. We're looking at doing a program where using the clean development mechanism, which is therefore funded from European countries, we'll deliver 30 million energy efficient light globes to 7.5 million poor people. That equates to 2 weeks worth of wages for each of those families. If you aggregate that, that's $165 million US dollars worth of saving to those families, and to the government, $200 million worth of subsidy, direct subsidy for energy, $365 million. Now, the nice thing about that is the whole USA budget was only 30 million, and we're giving a 25% return on investment for the investors that are playing in the program.
So there's a power of aligning the profit motive with what needs to happen.
Yeah.
And Lars, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, because I wanted to start off what is the task. And if we believe in an equitable world in this century, that will mean that we can consume, each of us, 1 ton of carbon per year, basically. What does that equate to? Well, it means that every day we have to decide if we're going to buy a T-shirt this day, eat, or alternatively eat a hot meal, or maybe drive your car 20 kilometers. That's the task. It's a monumental task, which means that it's a complete rebuild of our society that we have to do. So that there are no quick fixes. And there are so much investment that needs to be done. And almost all of that investment need to come from business, from the private sector. And the private sector can deliver that, as I said in my earlier statement. But the private sector need to be able to create value to do that. So if they are able to do profits, which is value, there has to be a price on carbon. And the price on carbon comes from that we set a cap, that we get scarcity value. And if we have scarcity value and a cap, then there is a price. And if there is a price, we can trade. And if we trade, we can minimize the cost, because that resource allocation in the world. And that's why it's so fundamentally important. And if we turn it into an opportunity, it's the biggest opportunity since the rebuild of the world after the Second World War.
You know, you mentioned the Second World War, and it seems that the studies of the Second World War is that we didn't get out of the depression that the world was in until there was this war. And are you almost implying, Lars, that the war against climate change could be one of the ways out of the recession that we're in?
I'm absolutely convinced of that, or I would even put it harsher. If we don't handle it, it will be war, a real war.
Yes. Congressman.
Fred, you asked earlier what are some of the obstacles. One of the challenges, if we're going to fight lethal overheating and ocean acidification, if we don't involve the international community, and Pierre made, I think, the point very well, at least in our country, I think you run the reprise of Kyoto. In other words, what's our point of having a cap and trade system if the Chinese or the Indians or, pick your fall guy, that excuse. Now, frankly, with President Obama and a Democratic Congress, that's less likely to prevail. But in the minds of the American people, there is this sense of why should we do all this if somebody else is not? And there is a legitimate business case of what does that do to disadvantage our pulp and paper industry. I have a lot of those in my district. And so I think one of the things that needs to happen in Copenhagen is a full court press to in some way involve an agreement with the developing world in a way that is equitable and respects their needs, but also removes the excuse of we can't do it because they won't do it. A little bit back to my analogy, like the doctor saying you have to reduce smoking to prevent lung cancer, and the person, no, I'm not going to until he does.
Well, so you're right. We need some clear targets for each country. We absolutely need it. That will fix the price. That will create the price. Once there is a price, and actually, if the benefits of that, if we're allowed to offset from America into Mexico, you will find that you'll be slower in America, but they'll be very quick. And so at the beginning, some of that offset's going to go to Mexico, and then you're going to catch up in America. But unless we have, everybody's got their target and they're clear, and you're 20 and 20, let's start there. There are some quick wins. Let's have some of the quick wins while we're developing this. You'll see trade.
It almost seems when I listen to the discussion that you're describing the cap as creating customers. The cap creates customers. Pierre, is that the way you see it? I see you nodding your head, but...
There's a couple of things I want to add. I think first, yes, the cap create customers. I think we're not leveraging public opinion enough on this thing, because as we were just discussing, it has created, people focus on the allowance, but at the end of the day, you've got a certificate, which are reduction mechanisms, which are real business happening all over the planet, which without this cap and trade emission would never have gone off the ground. Why? Because there was no pricing to reward them. And I think when you look at
so you're almost describing, and Lars was also, that the system creates a hunt for the lowest cost reduction opportunities.
Definitely. And I think this is back to accountability. You could really envisage that in a couple of years' time, and that's the best thing the regulators could do, is to have like an accounting standard for how much is a company producing carbon, or in water, or in soil remediation problems, or in natural resource usage. And people then going to have to see, okay, well, that's what it costs, and then they're going to have to change. Then they're going to have to do productive investments to reduce that. And it's all about wasted management, which means it's all going to be more profitable for the companies who do invest. And I think that's another thing where we're not leveraging the public opinion. I only discovered the McKinsey study while I was preparing for the speech at the United Nations. And before that, I have not seen anywhere. There was a great research from Princeton on the 7 wedge that was showing that it was in existing technology we could already use to remedy to a lot of things. So that was one thing killed off immediately, like we already can do something about it from a technology point of view. The second thing that McKinsey and Vattenfall study showed is that it's profitable. And if you look at the public opinion, what I find extraordinary is that, and I've not done a scientific thing of it, it's just me reading everything all the time, I don't think you see a backlash, and people should say that in their own country they see a backlash of public opinion about the cap and trades and the cost of carbon. You know, when they argue about the cost of electricity bill, I don't see that a lot of it is related to the carbon cost. It's much more related to, you know, the margin that the electricity producer might have. So just tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've got a public opinion against us, and we should leverage it much more.
I want to return to you, Congressman, because you brought up an important point that in America, there's going to be a great expectation that even though we don't necessarily agree that global warming is the best term for it, the word global is in there, and we're going to need global participation. We're going to need commitments from all nations in order to get where we need to go. I, for one, am heartened that the new administration in America has said we're going to have a cap-and-trade system, and your colleague, Congressman Waxman, has said that out of his committee there'll be initial legislation by the end of May. And I understand Speaker Pelosi has now promised there will be a vote this year. I believe, but I want to ask you if you would agree or not, that if the United States administration can come to Copenhagen in December with legislation that says we are going to make a commitment, that we are in a much better position to ask more from the developing nations. Is that?
Absolutely. You know, Al Gore gave the example of the ham and eggs example. If some of you were here yesterday, it's an old saying in the States of we could have ham and eggs for breakfast if we had some ham, and then if we had some eggs. You know, I mean, the point here is, yes, and I just want to underscore, the sea change with Barack Obama is astonishingly profound. He gets it. He understands it. He's committed to it. And for the first time, we now have a Congress that gets it. Speaker Pelosi fully understands it. Majority Leader Reid fully understands it in the Senate. And we have the votes. Those are the sweetest words in the English language in my experience. But if we don't market it right and structure it right, let me share with you the world I live in, and it is this. The opponents, the skeptics of lethal overheating, you can call it global. Don't call it global warming, call it global overheating. I can get that. I'm closer there. And also throw in acidification, because the skeptics have all packaged their arguments to say, well, temperatures come and go. But ocean acidification, friends, is demonstrable in a lab. You can, in a lab, put CO2 above water, watch the water dissolve the CO2, the water becomes more acidic water takes up carbonate, carbonate's not available for shelled organisms, death of oceans, end of oxygen, game over. We can do that. So focus always on acidification or overheating.
We better not do that, by the way.
But we are doing it. But we have to do it in our rhetoric. Now, here's the world we live in, and we have to prepare for it. If the argument can be made that your power bills will go up, here's my world. At a time when the American economy faces severe crisis, Congressman Brian Baird voted to increase your power bills and raise the cost of gasoline.
You have a career in voiceover, sir.
And the problem is we have to be able to beat that. I think we can, but I think we need to be very strategic about how we do it. And the arguments of you can actually lower costs, create jobs, and reduce lethal overheating, that has to be at the forefront. And put money back in the pockets of consumers. And we have to be able to have the flowery, positive ad that's credible in the counter.
Now, Lars.
Yeah, I just would like to remind us of that we need to have a global trading system, and which means that every country of the world, basically, or all the big countries of the world, must participate. We are sitting here coming from the developed world. I think we must create a feeling that everybody would like to participate. So everybody needs to feel invited.
Just as everyone wanted to participate in the WTO,
absolutely,
we've got to structure the carbon market so it's a magnet to have the developing countries incented that they see it as something that they want to do.
Absolutely. And I see two important elements of it. One, we spoke before of the Vattenfall McKinsey cost curves. Those can be done on a national basis, which means that every country can see this is what I could do and this is what it would cost me. Of course, for the developing world, they could rightly so say, I cannot afford more than, take an example, 50%. And I can only commit to 50%. And maybe the European Union commits to 120%. But that's okay. And what happens then is that we will get different price levels in, say, China and United States. But the interesting thing is that that would be okay, because then we can have an exchange mechanism between trading rights in China and trading certificates in United States.
How do we deal with Pierre's point, if I may,
Sure.
about an imbalanced competitive environment when many people already feel that? How do we tell our workers or our employers?
Can I just answer that? Because I think that, to me, that's so terribly important.
Go ahead, Lars, and after you do, I want to open it up to the audience.
Because this
chime in.
mechanism will exactly do what your question is, because it will prevent carbon leakage. It will keep the jobs in the United States, because at that you create a mechanism where you can get the level playing field, and you will actually do that, but at the same time have funds flowing to the developing world, because in the optimization of resource allocation, it's simply more cheap to do it in China than to do it in the United States or Europe. And that will, at the same time, preserve the jobs in the US. So I think this is the Gordian knot to cut.
Let's go to the audience. And do we have a question? Yes?
Michael Statuchbury from the Australian newspaper. A lot of agreement on the stage up there. Can I get a readout as to whether you think it is really conceivable that the United States will vote for a full cap and trade system, within a year or two? People talk about Obama, but his target for cutting emissions is relatively modest. It's I think it's zero change on 1990 levels. So he's not going for big cuts. So he hasn't really pushed the whole system yet. And to me, it just doesn't seem that the American system, the culture there, is ready for this big system. It will be very. There's a lot of sort of regulation and cost involved in this sort of system, I would imagine. And can you imagine China having this as well? And can you imagine anybody being able to trust the carbon accounting in a country like China or Italy or anywhere else?
Okay, a serious, thoughtful challenge. Congressman, first of all, on the political prospects of actually getting something this big done in the United States?
First of all, part of the reason I favored the 20 and 20 model that I described is you don't have to pass legislation, you just change your behavior. And we could all do that. We could all do it tomorrow. We don't need literally an act of Congress. I believe we could do it at the individual level right away, and it's much more ambitious, but also more achievable. In the Congress, the obstacles will be two predominantly. One, obstacles from the lethal warming skeptics, predominantly Republicans. And two, opposition, understandably, from Democrats who represent coal states. And they will not have Lars there explaining how it can be a wonderful thing for coal-fired power plants to have a cap-and-trade system, and they will be scared to death about that. So if you can surmount those obstacles, the key obstacle, as always, the House member will say, is the Senate. And the Senate, because of our rules, esoteric, some of you know, are a filibuster. One person can hold up the entire thing unless you have a 60-vote majority. And that is difficult to obtain, given that some of the senators will be from coal states and we don't have a clear Democratic majority. However, I think we will make substantial progress, and again, to the degree that we can demonstrate the Chinese or Indians or others could, to some extent, shame the Americans. And if Lars' argument can be persuasive, there's a chance to say, yes, it is actually in our best economic and health and survivable interest. So I think there is a possibility, certainly vastly better than there was a year ago.
Just as an American, I would also agree with the Congressman and say, I think the essence of what you said is it's not going to be easy to get this law through, but with a presidential commitment, I do think it's doable, certainly within the year or two time frame, and we're going to do everything we can to press it to happen before Copenhagen, because that would really be a game changer. You've also raised concerns I don't want to give short shrift to about transparency and accounting and auditing, and I don't know, Pierre or Lars or Nick, Pierre?
Well, just one number for you is that, I don't know if you know that nearly half of the...
Pierre, if you could just move the microphone closer.
So nearly half of the current certificates for emission and reduction that are the basis for the trading in Europe are coming from China and India. And the market of participants like the utilities, like the companies, like financial investor, is already much more volatile based on, execution risk, based on accounting, based on projects which are bogus, but also based on change in regulation. So it's unavoidable. It's actually desirable because these are long-term projects. The CER trading is based on projects that are going to come within the next 5 years. And the new regulatory regime is that they're not bankable before the next 5 years. So in Europe, I think that's a lesson for the rest of the world training scheme. We've already had a lot of dealings with these problems, and it seems that the policymakers have done quite a good job at finding where we could be having issues. Now, there will be some, but they seem to have learned a lot already since 2005, when it really started.
I saw a question over here. Yes?
I'm Robert Engel from New York University. I basically would favor carbon tax, but the point I'd like to make is that it seems to me to convince consumers and voters that either one of these plans is a good one, you should focus on the revenue rather than the tax part. And my favorite suggestion would be that you advertise this as the income that's coming from the auction of these certificates would be redistributed, and perhaps in advance of the certificate trading actually being in place, it would be advanced to consumers today with a big advertising campaign that this is what you're going to get. You're going to get, this $10,000 check. This is your chance to put in your efficient light bulbs, buy your hybrid car, insulate your house, do all these things that are industries which are struggling in the U.S. at this particular moment. And it actually is a stimulating policy rather than a competition for
advertise
resources.
the benefits of launching the system and auctioning the permits. Nick, you had a comment?
I think that's right. And we've seen, for example, in New South Wales, they had a small, in Australia, had a very small trading system, but it had a bit that could do demand side. So actually the system came in and immediately we were doing things in people's homes which cut their costs. And you saw some people having their costs by 20%. So then when the power's going up, they're still below what they expected. So that really works. Michael, as a fellow Australian, I would just say, first of all, Australia did very well to suddenly ratify Kyoto and now has got an emissions an ETS scheme with very, very low targets. Doesn't include energy efficiency. We have got a lot of work, given that we are per capita the highest emitters of CO2 on the planet. So we've got to be careful about what we do. And they are saying they'll change like our new Prime Minister did. You have to deliver. There is no doubt that they have to deliver. And in terms of your voiceover, I would say a couple of things. I have heard people on this stage, of the head of Duke, the head of BP, the head of Shell saying, bring it on. We have been looking at this space for 20 years. We have been wanting to work in this space. We cannot change until there is a tax and a level playing field, whatever you call it. And once there is, those of us that have been committed to this is new industry, this is new opportunity, this is new jobs, this is new profits. But it needs to be clear, and we need to know what it's going to look like in 20 years, because then we will change our businesses, just like you said. Then we'll plan for it.
Larry Summers, the president's economic advisor, told me the other day, if you tell somebody yes, they know what to do. If you tell them no, they know what to do. But if you tell them, I don't know what the rules are, and I'm not sure when we will know, paralysis. Yes. And that paralysis right now is freezing investment in the electric utility sector in America because the rules aren't clear. I saw more hands in the audience. Yes.
Paul Roberts. I'm an energy writer from the States. So we've heard a little bit about sector differences in terms of responses. Pulp and paper was brought up. I'm curious for your thoughts on how the energy sector is likely to respond to this, particularly oil and gas. You mentioned BP a bit, but it'd be interesting to get a broader sense. And agriculture as well. Agriculture is going to be a big player here. It's a sector whose response has been complicated somewhat by biofuels, which is, of course, sold both as a climate solution but also as a contributor. So I'd be interested to get your sense of how those two sectors are likely to respond in terms of possibly obstructing this but also possibly accelerating this. Thanks.
So, Lars?
Yeah. I think I can be very, very brief, because the way industry works is very simple. As Fred says, if we know the rules of the game, and if we believe that the level playing field is there, not perfect, but it's there, then industry has no problem whatsoever. Will immediately react and will immediately deliver to the new rules of the game. That goes for all industries all over the world.
You also asked about agriculture. In the United States, there's a new phenomenon happening where many of the folks who grow crops, the wheat growers, the barley growers, have now written to the senators and the congressmen saying, we want to be able to be part of the solution, allow reductions from our changing practices which sequester carbon in the soil and build organic content, make our farmlands more fertile, and take carbon dioxide out of the air. Let them count too in the accounting system so we can also earn by helping reduce the levels in the air. And I think that's a very promising development. I saw another question.
Dan Sperling from University of California, Davis and California Air Resources Board, and it's in the latter role I have a question, and that is, I hear all this discussion about carbon markets and cap and trade, and they're kind of seen as a single thing. In California, we're approaching it different, and I see carbon markets evolving in a different way, and I'm curious reaction to this. What we're doing, in our case, cap and trade is accounting for only about 20% of the reductions that we're aiming for. The rest are coming from a whole series of other measures, from energy efficiency, renewable portfolio standards, low carbon fuel standards, and some of these others have their own market. So the low carbon fuel standard, for instance, creates a market for carbon trading among energy supply, transportation energy suppliers. We have another standard for automakers, and that allows for trading between automakers. Now, and that's going to be could be a separate market. Now, eventually, all of the, as these markets start functioning, I can imagine, the cars and the oil companies market will be integrated and so on. But in any case, it's very different from everything I hear here. And I also think in Washington, D.C., they're misunderstanding the opportunities.
So thanks, Dan, for the question. I think the question is, as I get it, that we've been focusing on this panel about cap and trade, but in fact in California, one of the real pioneers in the world, the first American full economy-wide cap and trade system, the reductions are being achieved by many complementary measures as well as this economy-wide mandatory cap. Is that consistent with how it's likely to happen in the United States, Congressman?
Nick has something.
Well, we've been working right around the US for the last year and a half. I'm not doing very much because the environment's not been great, but what's true about California is they have led the world in energy efficiency from the 70s. They've had extraordinary standards, and so this is a lot of ands here. So you're right, they do it very differently. However, they don't have an open market. So what happens is energy efficiency is owned by the three big power companies, and for organizations like us, we don't come. They control it. They don't have to work outside of that, and they've got plenty of time. We now don't have time. You did it right in California. You started 30 years ago. The rest of the world didn't. We've got to move quicker. One of the interesting things is too, and Michael, you said it a little bit before, what's going to happen in Italy and China, and can we trust systems? We don't have. We did have an Indian representative, actually. They are unavailable to be here. China have created extraordinary environmental policy that America could look to and follow. Brazil, last night or yesterday, when it was earlier this week, announced a whole fund to actually support energy efficiency. We have trading systems now within Europe and the clean development mechanism that actually, every light bulb I give away, 30% of the cost is to account for when it goes on and when it goes off, and is it being used? 30%.
You know, this is not light. This has been going now for 5 or 6 years. It is not simple. It's not easy. And we did get some things wrong. But let's not lose that. We have the ability to move quick.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you also for bringing up the fact that China, in fact, has already made some very important commitments to reduce their carbon intensity in their economy and do other things. And Brazil has recently made some important commitments. There was a question
Let me just address the one tremendous advantage of a cap potentially is there are many ways to get there. I believe Copenhagen's got to set 350, and we've got to set it as a prompt limit, not a 2050 limit. And so my belief is the cap and trade system needs to move aggressively and rapidly towards that limit, and that whatever the cap is, we set at reaching 350 globally, and move from there.
Fantastic. Yes.
I'm Gabriela Ramos from the OECD, and I couldn't agree more. I think that addressing the challenge of as you call it, overheating, lethal overheating, requires policy mixes from different countries. And you can settle a price, and you could settle a tax, or you could settle standards or technological advances of everything. But when it gets to the carbon markets, I'm always puzzled by understanding how would all these independent initiatives and ways of doing things in the EU, in the US, I hope you will establish something on a national level. How would all that got into a global carbon markets, and how would this operate to really put the real framework into something that is efficient globally?
Lars?
Let me try and briefly answer that, because there is no way we're going to have a harmonized cap and trade system globally, because all countries, and let's take one, United States, will always like to design their own system. So will China as well. So how can we get that to a working global market? Well, I would like to use the analogy of currencies. In Europe we have euros. In United States we have dollars, but we can still trade, and there is an exchange rate. And this is exactly the pragmatic way of how to go about globalizing a cap and trade market. And that is actually a very valuable tool, which I tried to explain before, both in funding streams but also in preventing carbon leakage.
I think we have time for another question. Yes?
Cap and trade in the United States to reduce or prevent the lethal overheating that you refer to seems very feasible, and necessary, and I am all in favor of that. I worry about the world in which they are developing. China is producing 70 gigawatts of coal, adding every year. In a developing economy, in a rapidly developing economy, how can you cap that?
How can you cap that, Lars?
Well, you pointed why we are in such a hurry. And there is another thing apart from cap and trade, because I think it's a correct observation from California that cap and trade will not fix everything. And that is advanced acceleration of technology development. And what China needs, what the world needs, is clean coal. And that's carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, is here, there, but needs to be commercialized. The cap and trade system today will not make it profitable to get down the learning curve. So we need to accelerate that. The European Union has just now put money on the table. That needs to be done as quickly as possible, so China and all of the world can get, and United States as well, can get access to that technology, because that is a prerequisite to solve this problem.
One more question, yes. One's coming.
I'm Vice Chairman of World Energy Council for the area of Asia Pacific and South Asia. And I've always seen in my area that there is a very clear climate change divide. And we all agree that without active positive participation of China and India, we cannot have a good carbon system. And so in my area, I have persuaded Mr. Zhang Gobao, is the director of State Energy Agency. He's in charge of energy in China. And Minister of Power, Mr. Razan of India, both agreed to China-India summit this year to discuss this matter. But still, I have trouble with it. When they get together, there is very strong argument about this climate change, as Congress might know already. They have the argument that emission per capita argument. They are still very low in terms of emission per capita. And also they blame, they feel like the blame lies with Western countries. They built up all these carbons. And the third argument they have is that economic development is a matter of survival for these countries. So what they strongly argue and ask for is the Western country to transfer the technology to improve the efficiency in an affordable price. Congressman Baird, how would you respond to that kind of argument?
I think you're absolutely right on all fronts. One of the paradoxes is that lethal overheating and ocean acidification, I'm going to simplify it to that, and lethal overheating and ocean acidification will have actually, for many of the poor people in India and China, because of the elevation, last year Bono and Al Gore talked about that at this very location, would have a profoundly adverse impact, more adverse possibly in the greater population of China and India than the developed world. But they're absolutely right that the large part of today's problem has been created by the developed world, and therefore it's incumbent upon us to lead in two ways. First, by lowering our own emissions dramatically and promptly, and second, by exchanging the technology sort of in an open source kind of model that will do that. A cap and trade system may help incentivize that, but again, I think we've got a moral responsibility and an economic self-interest in doing it and leading that. But the arguments against putting the blame on the developing world are absolutely legitimate, and we need to own that.
Yes, why don't we just go down the panel, have some closing comments, and we'll close it out. Pierre.
Yeah, in a way to answer a couple of these questions, the cap and trade was the beginning of pricing the carbon liabilities. If we could promote a global accounting standard to basically show how much liabilities are created by the various actors, and then we could move to show, which we've done privately, that those with the lesser liability are being rewarded from an economic return. And that's going to answer the question of how do you promote that with the private sector, is that you're going to show that those guys who have done a better job are actually getting bigger economic returns, and that's going to promote more investment. And we were discussing yesterday that the bigger hurdle for renewable was the certainty. And again, I can't insist more that the certainty of pricing or the visibility of pricing that our carbon market shows is one of the biggest incentives for renewable investments.
We're running out of time, but quickly, Lars.
Yeah, I like to end off then very philosophically because of your question here. I think our dream, our joint shared dream must be that in the long term we will be equally rich. GDP per capita should be the same, and emissions per capita should be the same, which means that we have to design the world society into a low emission, low carbon society. So it's just clear, of course, now that developing worlds like China, India, and so on cannot take on the same commitments. But I think we should invite China, India to tell the rest of the world, what are you ready to do? And over the long term, as you get richer, you can do more. And finally, we will all do the same. So I think that's more a philosophical view, but I think it's important.
Thank you, Lars. Nick.
So Copenhagen is absolutely crucial. We don't have 2 years. So Copenhagen is crucial. We don't have 2 years. You have to lead, and even when that voice in your head says, but the prices are going to go up, you've got to fight for it. Our children, and you will, I get that. And we've got to do that all around the world. You've got to do it in China. We've got to do it in Mexico. We've got to do it in Brazil. We have not got to lose this opportunity. And we can do it partly because energy efficiency is here. It's on the shelves. We can deliver it tomorrow, and it saves people money, and we'll get them ready for the other things that have to come later.
Congressman.
Lethal overheating and ocean acidification is the problem. The solution is actually good for the economy, not bad for the economy. It has to happen immediately, and it should start with behavior change, 20% savings in 20 weeks.
Well, I think this has been a great, stimulating conversation. Thanks to all of you. I've taken away quite a few things of value. I hope we all leave with something of value. Things I heard were that cap and trade can actually help amplify the stimulus spending that the governments are doing, that in a sense it can be like World War II was, to help get us out of the recession. The war against global warming can help lift us out of this economic problem we are in, that it can incent huge amounts of private capital going into the new technologies, but we need to be careful designing the cap and trade market. We need transparency, proper accounting rules. That's very important. And we need to have a system that's designed to throw off resources and technology so the developing countries and everyone can participate. I would urge us all to go back to our home countries and carry on this conversation. For me, President Obama said it best a few weeks ago when he said cap and trade can be the way we kickstart the economy out of this recession. I love the notion that cap and trade starts a hunt for the lowest cost solutions, and the fact that if we align the profit motive with what we need for the world, really great things can happen because the entrepreneurs all go to work. So in closing, as I said at the beginning, I posed it as a question at the beginning, but I now have great confidence that if we do this right, if we get going on a cap and trade system, we can save ourselves from ourselves. Thank you very much.